They said his bones had grown wrong, that God himself had twisted him out of mercy or mockery. The boy was no taller than a barrel, his back bent like an old branch. When Eli McCreary bought him at auction for 8 cents, no one bid against him. No one wanted a creature so small, so strange. The overseer laughed as he shoved the boy forward. "A dwarf for the cotton press," he said. "Maybe the machine'll have pity where man won't." They called him Button. His head was round, too large for his frail neck, and his eyes carried the dull shine of someone who had seen cruelty so long it became air. The plantation stretched wide across Georgia clay, its white fields shimmering with the illusion of purity. But beneath that brightness was rot, sweat, blood, and the slow hum of machines that pressed life into profit. The cotton press towered in the barn's center like an altar. Thick beams, iron screws, and a grinding wheel large enough to crush an ox. The smell of grease and old harvest hung like incense. The first time Button saw it, he whispered to himself, "It breathes." The others laughed, but the boy could feel its pulse through the floorboards. Eli McCreary hated the boy's silence. He mocked his shape, called him God's leftover. When Button stumbled, Eli pressed the child's small hand against the turning wheel. Not enough to break it, just enough to draw blood. "Learn what pressure means," he said. That night thunder rolled across the fields. The workers had gone. Eli drank, cursing his luck, his land, his slaves. But from the barn came a sound like the slow winding of judgment, the creak of the press turning by itself. When the morning came, they found Eli McCreary's skull flattened beneath the beam. The boy was crouched nearby, oil on his hands, whispering. The press woke up. 8 cents. That was the measure of his worth, the sum of his breath, his bones, his suffering. In the plantation's ledger, Eli McCreary had written neatly, "One male dwarf, defective limb, 8 cents." The handwriting was precise, almost sacred, as if cruelty could be made divine by good penmanship. Button did not understand numbers, but he understood tone, the way people spoke around him like he was less than air. The world was heavy and he bore it in silence. The field stretched endless and pale. Cotton swayed like ghosts of those who never escaped it. Inside the McCreary house, everything smelled of false piety. A marble Christ hung above a dining table where no prayer could be clean. Margaret McCreary, Eli's wife, read from a prayer book written in Latin. She claimed the words could purify the broken. Sometimes she forced Button to recite them. He could not understand the language, but the sounds stirred something deep, a vibration older than scripture, a memory that hummed beneath his ribs. At night, when the others slept, he went to the barn. There the press waited, still and immense. Its wooden gears gleamed under moonlight, and the boy placed his palm on the iron screw, feeling its chill seep through his skin. "You understand," he whispered. Each day Margaret grew quieter. She stared at Button as if he were both curse and miracle. When Eli's body was found crushed, she did not weep. She simply said, "The Lord punishes the proud," but the workers whispered otherwise. They said the boy had spoken to the press and it had listened. They said the machine was hungry now and that Button was its priest. The sheriff came at dawn, chewing tobacco and dread. He circled the body, muttered something about accident, and spat into the dirt. The press had stopped turning, its screw gleaming clean, but no one could explain how a locked machine could move on its own. Button was found kneeling near the corpse, rocking back and forth. His hands were covered not in blood but in oil, thick, black, and smelling faintly sweet. When they lifted him, he said in a small voice, "It woke hungry." The townsfolk whispered that he was possessed. Others said Margaret had bewitched him. She stood silent through the investigation, her eyes hollow and calm. It was judgment, she told the sheriff. Eli was pressed down by his own sins. After Eli's burial, Margaret ordered that the boy remain. "He belongs here," she said. "The Lord speaks through what he breaks." But her servants noticed changes in her. She no longer prayed aloud. She spent hours in the barn, tracing patterns into the wood of the press. circles, lines, and words that no one recognized. At night, she lit candles before it, whispering the Latin verses from her book. The air inside thickened with a strange rhythmic sound, one like breathing through wood. Some said the cotton press had grown an eye, a knot in the timber that shifted when no one looked directly at it. Then one evening, Margaret came to supper with grease under her nails. When a maid asked why, she smiled faintly and said, "Because I've anointed the altar." From that night on, the barn doors were kept locked. By autumn, the fields grew too fast. The cotton plants rose thick and heavy, bending under their own weight. The soil pulsed with damp warmth, and when workers picked the bolls, red stains clung to their fingers. "Blood of the earth," one said. Margaret began her sermons. She gathered the slaves in the barn, forcing them to kneel before the press. There was no Bible in sight. "Pressure," she preached, "is the will of God. The world is corrupt because it refuses to be compacted." Each turn of the screw groaned through the air like a dying prayer. Button stood beside her, silent, eyes hollow. She called him the small prophet. Sometimes when she spoke, he moved his hands as though echoing the rhythm of the gears. Then the disappearances began. 3 workers gone, their names crossed out of the ledger. No graves, no mourning, only the creak of the press turning after midnight. The others swore they heard voices within the wood, low, pleading, crushed. The overseer threatened to burn the barn. Margaret struck him across the face and said, "Touch it, and you'll feel the hand of God." He left that night and never returned. The next morning, the barn's door bore a deep indentation, as if something inside had pushed outward, yearning to escape. The plantation continued as if under a spell. The cotton gleamed whiter, the harvest larger, but none dared speak. Every prayer in the quarters ended with the same whispered plea, "Deliver us from the press." In early 1852, Reverend Josiah Grant arrived uninvited at McCreary Plantation. He was known for unmasking sin, a lean gray man with eyes like judgment. He said God had sent him visions, a wooden altar, a twisted boy, and a machine that ate prayer. Margaret welcomed him with eerie warmth. She hosted him 3 nights. Each evening he preached redemption under a portrait of Christ whose face seemed to darken with the candlelight. But the Reverend grew uneasy. The boy never left the barn, and every night the sound, that faint turning of the press, echoed like a heartbeat through the walls. On the 3rd night, Grant found Margaret's prayer book open on her desk. The Latin words had changed. The ink was red. He copied one line before fleeing. "The Lord below forgives through weight." When he confronted her, Margaret only smiled. "The Lord you serve was never above," she said. "He waits beneath us." Grant fled into the storm screaming scripture. His horse returned without him. Days later they found his Bible in the mud, pages fused together as if pressed. The confession book was discovered years later, its cover marked with a small handprint burned deep into the leather. The handwriting inside trembled between prayer and madness. The press remembers every soul it touches. By the time spring came, the plantation had become silent as a graveyard. The laughter of the enslaved children was gone. Even the cicadas avoided the fields. Button wandered alone among the cotton rows, his feet sinking into the red earth that seemed to breathe beneath him. When the rain fell, it wasn't clear but pink, streaks of rust and something thicker like the soil had begun leaking memory. Margaret walked the property barefoot now, her hair loose, her dress gray with ash. "The harvest will feed the kingdom," she whispered to no one. "The pressure cleanses." The townsfolk avoided her. Rumors spread like plague, that the widow McCreary had gone mad with grief, that she let the dwarf boy conduct rites in the barn, that she fed the machine with what the Lord had forgotten. One night a curious neighbor rode close enough to see. The barn doors were open, candlelight spilling like molten gold. Inside figures knelt in a circle, Faces shrouded, arms lifted toward the great wooden press. It turned slowly by itself, wood moaning, rope creaking, and at its base Button stood anointing the screw with blood. When the neighbor returned home, he told no one what he'd seen. His house caught fire the next morning, and his tongue, blackened and swollen, was found in the ashes. By midsummer, the cotton was redder than ever. The overseer who took the yield to market swore he could hear faint murmurs rising from the bales. When he pressed his ear close, it sounded like hundreds of voices praying beneath their breath, repeating one terrible phrase: "The weight is holy." The first outsider to enter the McCreary grounds after Reverend Grant's disappearance was his daughter Clara. She was 19, a teacher, and known in the county for her relentless faith. She came with nothing but her father's cracked Bible and a belief that sin could always be named. The townspeople begged her not to go. They said the widow was possessed, that the dwarf was a demon. But Clara was resolute. "If the devil hides in Georgia," she said, "then Georgia must learn to pray louder." She reached the plantation near dusk. Margaret greeted her with a smile too gentle to be human. "You look like your father," she said. "He came here to judge, but he learned to kneel." Clara stayed the night. The rooms were heavy with the smell of oil and something faintly metallic. The portraits on the walls had been turned to face the plaster. At supper, Button stood behind Margaret's chair holding a single candle that dripped down his arm without burning him. That night, Clara dreamed of the press. She saw her father's hand reaching through its beams, skin pale and flattened like parchment. When she awoke, her nails were black with grease. In the morning, Margaret took her to the barn. "You seek to understand," she said. "Then look." The press loomed in the dimness, breathing, shifting, whispering. In its timber, Clara saw faces, dozens, perhaps hundreds, and in their distorted mouths her father's voice spoke first. "The Lord below forgives through weight." After that day, Clara never spoke again. She lived, but her voice was gone, drawn out like thread and woven into silence. The townsfolk found her wandering the road days later, her eyes milky, her hands clutching a small wooden token, a splinter from the press. When they asked what had happened, she only mouthed one word: "Button." The boy had changed. He no longer moved like a child, but like something imitating humanity. The slaves whispered that he sang at night, a low, vibrating hum that made the nails in the walls tremble. They called it the Song of Pressure. Margaret called it prayer. Every night she lit her candles and stood beside him as he sang to the machine. The gears turned in rhythm with his breath, the air thick with incense and iron. Sometimes, the barn filled with faint shapes, shadows pressed against the walls, bending and stretching as though trying to climb free. When a new preacher from Savannah arrived, determined to cast out whatever dwelt there, he entered the barn with a crucifix. They found him at dawn, crushed beneath the press. His spine was flattened to dust, and Button, standing beside the body, sang softly, the same tune, endlessly repeating, "The weight remembers." The plantation grew wealthier that season. The cotton bloomed unnaturally thick, and traders whispered that McCreary's soil was blessed. But every bale weighed heavier than it should have. No matter how much they cut, the yield never ran out, because the land had learned to multiply what it consumed. In 1854, a federal investigator arrived in secret. Too many preachers had vanished. Too many rumors had reached Washington. His name was Silas Brant, a man who believed more in reason than God. He came disguised as a cotton buyer, carrying a pistol and a small notebook. From the start, he knew the plantation was wrong. The air was too still. The workers spoke in whispers. The barn loomed on the horizon like a cathedral for something unholy. Margaret met him on the porch, her eyes dim and soft. "You'll find our books in order," she said. "We keep everything pressed neat," and she was right. The ledgers were immaculate, except for one. Inside a small leather-bound journal, Brant found entries written in two hands. Margaret's and another smaller script he did not recognize. The pages listed not weights of cotton but names, each followed by a date and a number marked inches. At the bottom of the last page, a note read, "The flesh compacts to 1 inch for each confession." The soul flattens last. That night Brant entered the barn. He found the press gleaming under candlelight, the boy asleep beside it. As he stepped closer, the floor creaked and Button's eyes opened. "You came to write it down," he said. "Now it will write you." Brant aimed his pistol, but the press began to move. Slowly, majestically, with the sound of breath being drawn in. The candles flickered. The journal in his pocket grew hot, ink bleeding through his coat. His body was never found. But his notebook surfaced months later in a Savannah pawn shop, its cover warped as though something heavy had rested upon it. By the final year before the war, McCreary Plantation had become a place of quiet terror. The harvests were endless, the profits obscene, but no one stayed long. Workers vanished. Ministers stopped visiting. The townspeople crossed themselves when the wind blew from that direction. Inside the house, Margaret hosted what she called the Feast of Pressure. She invited the wealthiest families from neighboring counties. They came in carriages, curious and trembling, unsure whether it was madness or revelation that awaited. The dining room was lit by iron lamps shaped like screws. The tablecloths were stained crimson, though no one spoke of it. Margaret stood at the head, radiant and hollow-eyed. Beside her, Button held a silver bowl filled with oil and bone fragments ground to powder. "My husband fed this land," she said. "He pressed it into devotion. Tonight you shall do the same." When the guests laughed nervously, she motioned to the barn doors. Slowly, the press began to turn on its own, the groaning sound echoing across the field. The lights flickered. The plates trembled, and every guest, to their horror, felt their breath shorten, as though something unseen were weighing down upon their chests. One woman fell to the floor, gasping. A man screamed as his ribs cracked inward. The sound of grinding wood rose to a fever pitch, and over it all Button sang, "The Lord below forgives through weight." When morning came, the carriages were still there. The house was silent. Only the fields moved, tall, white, and red at the roots. By 1855, McCreary Plantation was abandoned by the living. Or so it seemed. The county sheriff sent men to reclaim the land. But those who entered the barn never returned whole. Some came back blind, some forgot how to speak, and one fell to his knees the moment he crossed the threshold, whispering, "He's awake under the floor." Word spread through Georgia like fever. Preachers called it the Devil's Acre. Scientists from Savannah claimed it was magnetism, swamp gas, or madness born of grief. But none could explain the sound, a deep, rhythmic groan that rolled across the land at midnight, like a great wooden lung inhaling. The church sent a letter to Margaret, demanding repentance. Her reply arrived a week later, written in red wax and sealed with a thumbprint. Inside was a single page, "Your God breaks the poor. Mine teaches them how to press back." Her handwriting was elegant, almost serene. In that same year, a traveler found an open Bible nailed to a tree near the property. The pages were fused together by oil. The only verse still visible read, "And the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." They said Margaret preached one last sermon before vanishing entirely. Those who heard it remembered her words through trembling lips. God was never high above. He was trapped beneath us, screaming under the weight of our mercy. And when she spoke that final line, the barn doors split down the center, and the ground trembled. The cotton fields bowed like worshippers. The land began to swallow itself. That night a storm broke unlike any before it. The sky hung low, almost touching the trees, and lightning forked down in silence. No thunder, just white fissures cracking through the air. Those who lived miles away claimed they saw the McCreary fields glowing, every stalk of cotton burning without smoke. Inside the barn, the press turned faster than ever, its iron groaning against the weight of eternity. Button stood before it, hands outstretched, eyes rolled white. He had grown, not in size but in presence. His skin seemed to ripple, the veins beneath his flesh pulsing in rhythm with the press. Margaret was gone. Some said she had merged with the wood itself. In the lamplight, the beams of the press bore faint outlines of a woman's body, not carved but embedded. Her face was stretched across the grain like fabric, her lips forever parted in prayer. Buttons sang and the sky answered. Rain fell upward, drawn into the storm. The earth convulsed. The house caved in. The cotton fields twisted together like serpents. And in that cataclysmic collapse, the air filled with voices, hundreds, thousands, all pressed into one continuous wail. By dawn, nothing remained but the barn. The land around it was flat as glass. The soil hardened into something dark and smooth. The press still stood untouched, humming softly, as if satisfied. In town, the few who dared to speak of it said the ground was sealed, but at night, if you pressed your ear against it, you could hear faint breathing from below, steady, patient, eternal. Years passed. The war came and went. Armies marched across Georgia, burning plantations, but the McCreary grounds were avoided. Horses refused to cross its borders. Maps began to omit it entirely. In 1872, a group of freedmen searching for lost relatives stumbled upon the site. What they found was unnatural. A patch of land where no plant grew except for thin white threads that pushed through the soil like hair. They tried to pull one free, but it extended endlessly downward, slick with moisture, humming faintly. One of the men, Isaiah Brooks, took a strand home, curious. That night his wife found him strangled, the thread coiled around his throat like silk. The next morning the spool had returned to the earth. The newspapers called it the River of Thread. Scientists visited, tested, speculated. One theorized that the fibers were organic remains compacted by mechanical force. But when a student tried to collect a sample, his hands blistered with burns shaped like fingerprints. An old woman in the nearby town claimed she knew the truth. That land still breathes, she said. Those threads ain't cotton, they're nerves. At night, under the new moon, travelers swore they saw a small figure walking the field's edge. A child, no taller than a barrel, his head tilted, his arms outstretched. Sometimes he sang, sometimes he carried something heavy in his arms that no one else could see. In 1903, a group of industrial developers from Atlanta came to purchase the land. They planned to build a textile mill, calling it Poetic Justice. The soil that once enslaved will now produce freedom. But when the surveyors broke the ground, their machines stopped working. Compasses spun, nails bent. Workers heard strange clicking noises from below, not like insects, but like gears turning. They found the old barn still standing, its roof intact, though no one had tended it in 50 years. Inside, under a shroud of dust, the press waited, perfectly preserved, gleaming faintly with oil that had never dried. One worker, a man named Cooper, touched the screw. "Feels warm," he said. The foreman laughed. "It's just metal." But that night the foreman's tent collapsed inward, crushing him to paste without a mark on the canvas. Cooper vanished the next morning. In his bunk they found a note written in crude letters. It called for me. The project was abandoned. The mill was never built. But those who came after swore that the press moved slightly every year, sinking deeper into the earth, as if dragging the land down with it. The white threads kept growing. They wrapped around trees, fences, bones. Some said they were roots. Others said they were veins. But one thing was certain, they were spreading. In 1927, long after the McCreary name had been erased from Georgia's records, a new church was built in the nearby town of Marston's Hollow. The foundation was poured using stone quarried from what locals called the Cursed Acre. From the moment it opened, the church was never silent. The pews creaked even when empty. The organ groaned by itself in the night, and when the pastor read scripture, the congregation swore they heard a faint second voice, lower, slower, whispering the same words in reverse. Within months, the pastor fell ill. He complained of pressure in his chest, as though an invisible weight were slowly crushing his ribs. On his final Sunday, he collapsed mid-sermon, clutching his Bible. When the deacons opened it, they found a single phrase written over every page. The Lord below forgives through weight. After his death, workers discovered something horrifying. Beneath the church floorboards, embedded in the foundation, was a fragment of iron, a broken screw, blackened but unmistakably part of the old McCreary press. The bishop ordered the church sealed. But the townsfolk say that if you pass by at midnight, you can still hear the faint sound of grinding wood, like a prayer being crushed. And beneath it, the voice of a small boy humming softly, endlessly, as though the sermon had never ended. In 1938, a geologist named Dr. Edwin Rokes came to Marston's Hollow to study strange vibrations that had been recorded beneath the old McCreary tract. His instruments showed rhythmic tremors, perfectly timed every 12 hours like a heartbeat pulsing under miles of clay. The locals warned him not to go near the old barn. They said the land hummed louder after dark, that animals refused to graze there, that sometimes the air tasted like metal. But Rokes was a man of science. He dismissed the warnings as folklore from an ignorant county. He arrived one morning with a truck full of seismographs and a young assistant named Lillian. The soil was dark, dense, and oddly warm. When he pressed his palm against it, he swore he could feel it moving, expanding and contracting, as though drawing breath. At dusk they heard the first sound, a long, low groan from deep beneath the earth like wood grinding against stone. Lillian clutched her ears. "It's not sound," she said, "it's pressure." That night the ground trembled again. One of the machines began ticking violently before bursting open, spewing oil that smelled faintly sweet. By morning, Lillian was gone. Her footprints led straight to the barn and ended there. The doors, though rotten, were warm to the touch. Inside, Rokes found the cotton press still standing, its screw faintly turning by itself. Beneath it lay a hollow in the floor, a perfect imprint of a human body pressed into the dirt. He dropped to his knees, trembling, whispering to the emptiness, "How are you still moving?" And the answer came, faint but unmistakable. From below his feet, the voice of a small boy, aged and patient, echoing through the ground. "The world turns by weight, not by will." Rokes fled that night, but he never left Georgia. He was found months later in a field 20 miles away. His body compacted to half its size, bones flattened like parchment. His seismograph tape, the only surviving record, captured one final pulse beneath the earth. 12 beats. Pause. 12 beats. Pause. The rhythm of something still alive, waiting to press again. In 1946, a carpenter named Amos Lyle was hired to repair the floorboards of the sealed church in Marston's Hollow, the one built from the McCreary stones. He was a quiet man, recently widowed, and needed the work. The bishop told him not to stay after sundown. Amos pried up the first board and stopped. The earth beneath was not dry soil, but a dark, compacted mass that gleamed under the light. It looked almost like flesh polished to stone. He leaned closer and saw faint patterns pressed into it, swirls, lines, even fingerprints. It pulsed faintly like something buried alive. He stepped back. The air had grown thick, humming low. And then he heard it, a child's voice, muffled but near. "Don't let them cover me again." Amos froze. His tools trembled in his hands. The voice came again, softer. "Please. It's so heavy." Heart pounding, he ripped up more boards. Beneath the floor, embedded in the dark mass, was a face, small, smooth, eyeless, yet unmistakably human. The mouth opened slightly, and from it issued a sound like turning gears. Amos stumbled backward. The boards began to creak on their own, sliding back into place, sealing the gap. The nails drove themselves in one by one as if guided by invisible hands. He ran to the door, but it slammed shut. The air grew thick and hot. Something vast moved beneath the church, the sound of weight grinding weight, slow and inevitable. From the altar came a whisper, almost kind. He never died. He was compacted, preserved. Every prayer that touches this floor presses him deeper. Amos screamed. The church trembled. When rescuers arrived at dawn, they found only his tools, each one flattened thin like paper cutouts of iron. The floorboards were smooth again, seamless. But when the new pastor entered to bless the place, he swore he could feel the boards rise slightly under his feet, as though something below had shifted closer to the surface. And that night, the organ played by itself. Not a hymn, not a melody, but the same rhythm that had haunted the land for nearly a century. 12 beats. Pause. 12 beats. Pause. By 1952, the church in Marston's Hollow had become a place of pilgrimage. Travelers came from distant towns claiming they'd heard the hum beneath their dreams. The bishop called it divine resonance, the breath of buried angels. He ordered the sermons to continue day and night, but the hymns changed. The organ no longer followed human rhythm. It echoed the tremor in the ground. Parishioners began to sway unconsciously, heads nodding in sync with the vibration. Some fell into trances, their eyes rolling back, whispering a name no one recognized. Jorah. The sermons grew darker. Preachers spoke of gravity as God's hand, of sins pressing down through generations until redemption could only come by weight. They quoted verses that didn't exist in any Bible, passages describing a child of compacted dust who would one day rise to reset the measure of all men. At first, no one questioned it. The congregation grew. People donated land, livestock, even children. The church coffers overflowed. But every sermon ended the same way. The preacher would lay flat on the pulpit whispering, "He is beneath us still." And he remembers. Then came the collapse. During a midnight revival, the floor of the church split open, swallowing half the congregation. Witnesses said they didn't fall. They were pulled, pressed downward by invisible hands. The organ roared without a player. The cross above the altar bent, twisting toward the earth as though in reverence. When rescuers dug through the debris, they found no bodies. Only a single object remained. The old cotton press screw perfectly upright in the soil, gleaming like new metal though it hadn't seen daylight in a century. Its threads were coated in something dark, something that smelled of oil and iron and salt. The bishop ordered the ruins sealed again. He said the ground must never be disturbed. But those who were there swore the hum didn't stop. In fact, it grew stronger, spreading through the hills, through the cotton fields, through the foundations of the town itself. And sometimes, at night when the air was still, the earth whispered through the cracks in the stone. We are all pressed in the same machine. By 1963, Marston's Hollow no longer appeared on maps. Roads that once led there were quietly rerouted. The government called it a subsidence hazard. The land was said to be unstable. But those who'd lived there knew better. They said the earth itself had taken the town back. Reporters who tried to investigate found nothing but fog and ruins. The air shimmered with static, compasses spun, and sound seemed to bend. One journalist, Claire Redmond, managed to reach what had been the church site. Her last transmission, sent over shortwave, was only 12 words long. The ground is breathing. I can hear children under the stone. Her voice was calm, almost peaceful. Then came a sound, a single heavy turn of a great screw, and silence. Weeks later, federal teams arrived with trucks and instruments. They found no town, no church, no human remains. Only a depression in the earth shaped like a vast spiral, as though the land had folded in on itself. The soil was dense, metallic, and warm. Impossible to penetrate with drills. They built a concrete barrier around the perimeter, installed warning signs, and left. But the workers who poured the cement said they could feel a vibration beneath their boots. One described it as the heartbeat of something buried too deep to die. Years passed. Trees grew over the site, their trunks twisted in slow circular motion. No birds sang there. And yet travelers claimed that when the wind blew right, they could still hear faint music, a hymn without melody, repeating in cycles, rising and falling like breath. Locals called it the City of Silence. Others called it the Pressing Ground. But in nearby towns, people whispered a darker name, the Boy Beneath Georgia. They said his body had fused with the clay, that every prayer, every confession, every sin pressed him tighter into the earth until his bones became the bedrock of the state. And when droughts came, when crops failed, when graves cracked open in old cemeteries, people would fall to their knees and murmur one phrase in the dark, "Forgive the weight we gave you." By 1979, nothing should have been left of Marston's Hollow. Satellite imagery showed only forest, a blank stretch of green. But pilots flying over the region reported distortions in their instruments. Compasses faltered. Radios hummed with a low-frequency pulse that repeated every 12 seconds. The rhythm had returned. A small team of historians, led by Dr. Helen Trask, went searching for the origin of the hum. She had spent her career studying acoustic hauntings, residual sounds tied to trauma. Her notes from the first night read, "The soil is alive. It exhales heat at regular intervals. It isn't geological. It's rhythmic, human." They camped near the site that once held the church. At midnight the forest fell silent. Then came a deep, resonant thud beneath them. Dust rose in perfect sync with the sound, 12 times. Pause. 12 times. Pause. Helen placed her ear to the ground and heard a child's breathing. Not weak, not ghostly. Rhythmic, patient, waiting. The team fled the next morning, but Helen stayed behind. Her final tape, recovered weeks later, contained her voice whispering through static. "He's not under us anymore. We're inside him. The land is his body. The air his sigh. Every nail, every prayer, every field that grew cotton, all part of the same machine. The weight was never meant to crush one man. It was meant to shape us all." Her tent was found empty. The ground beneath it was warm, perfectly smooth, a single spiral pressed into the soil. By the 1980s, the hum could be detected hundreds of miles away, faint but measurable. Some scientists blamed military sonar tests. Others called it continental settling. But old farmers knew the truth. They'd seen the field shift, felt the weight return, and whispered the story their grandfathers swore was real. The dwarf boy who crushed his master's skull had never stopped pressing. The machine had never stopped turning. Every injustice, every silence, every prayer built upon the same foundation, layer by layer, until even the living became part of the mechanism. And deep beneath Georgia's red clay, something vast and human continued to breathe, not dead, not dreaming, just waiting for the last board to fall.